Hey, in this video I will introduce you to clothing and textiles regulations in Australia. Right, so first we have chemicals and heavy metals regulations, move on to children's clothing, labeling requirements, and also lab testing for textiles. Right, let's begin with chemicals and heavy metals regulations. Well, the thing is that Australia is a lot more flexible when it comes to, well, textiles, chemicals, and heavy metals regulations compared to Europe or the United States. Well, to be specific, there aren't any, well, regulations that explicitly prohibit the usage of a wide range of chemicals and heavy metals in clothing and other textiles, as there is in the European Union, for example. However, there are guidelines and there are, well, restrictions on a number of substances, such as formaldehyde, for example, or PCBs. Now, the thing is that these are not, I mean, they're quite rare in fabrics these days, and the ACCC, they have the authority to recall products or issue forced recalls if they believe that a product does contain excessive amounts of substances such as ASO, formaldehyde, or PCBs, as I just mentioned. But there's no like clear-cut framework such as REACH in the EU or even California Prop 65 in California in the States. So it's very different from other markets, and essentially you can import textiles and clothing without any test report whatsoever. But this is compliance gate, and of course I recommend that you get the fabrics tested before you import them to Australia. Now, I'm going to get back to that at the end, but it can be quite difficult to find a compliance testing company, at least in Hong Kong or elsewhere in Asia, that covers Australian regulations. But as said, when it comes to chemicals compliance for textiles in Australia, it really comes down to a few specific substances anyway. So it's not really that difficult. And that also kind of answers the second question: how do I verify that my product doesn't contain substances that are, at least to some extent, regulated in Australia, or may, if in very excessive amounts, result in the goods being confiscated by domestic or state level market surveillance authorities. But that's quite rare when it comes to textiles anyway. But the only way to verify is through lab testing, and I'm going to get back to that at the end of this video, because we have helped many Australian importers with textiles compliance in the past, and we have strategies that apply specifically to companies in Australia. Another way, especially if you want to sell worldwide, and that's another thing we see with our Australian customers, is that I would say that most of our Australian companies we work with are not just selling within Australia, but also selling worldwide, specifically, well, primarily to the United States on Amazon and so on. And one thing you can do then is to actually ask your supplier to ensure that the products are, well, the fabrics are made to be compliant with OECO Tech Standard 100. That's a Swiss organization, and they sort of merge standards for the main, well, regulations or frameworks or chemical restrictions for the main markets. So you just have to refer to standard 100, and this means that the supplier will then procure fabrics or manufacture fabrics in compliance with EU and US chemicals regulations. Right, so this is a quote you can find on choice.com.au, and what's really interesting here, and this is also in a way, well, for being a developed country, Australia is very different in its very, very, what should I say, lax approach to all sorts of product regulations concerning substances, at least chemicals and heavy metals. Because as you see here, there are no legally prescribed limits on the use of any chemicals in textiles. And although you may not be allowed to import these chemicals in, as in its pure form into Australia, they can still be imported, and they are being imported into Australia as part of the chemical composition of a t-shirt, for example. Okay, now I believe, and I hope this will change in the future, Um, that would definitely be good for our business, but also for the sake of Australian consumers. But keep in mind that the regulators, if they believe that your product does contain excessive amounts of certain substances, although there may not be legally defined limits, they can still pull the product. So for that reason, and because this is compliance gate, and I would be an idiot if I said anything else, I still recommend that you get your product lab tested. Okay, or fabrics to be specific. Now, children's clothing, that's a different story. There are regulations that apply specifically to children's nightwear covering flammability, safety labeling, fabric testing, and more. And you can find information on productsafety.gov.au. This is actually a fantastic website. There's a list of mandatory regulations and a list of products that are covered. And in addition to that, they also set substance limits covering heavy metals primarily, lead, mercury, and so on, for children's toys. Toys. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure actually, but I believe that those limits also apply to children's clothing. Okay, so you find this information on productsafety.gov.au. Okay, labeling requirements. Now, in Australia and also New Zealand, because ASNZS, this stands for Australia Standard / New Zealand Standard, so they're actually harmonized across both countries. There is a standard that you also find on productsafety.gov.au covering the specific requirements for textiles labeling, but they can be summarized as following because it's quite basic. You need proper and accurate care instructions covering washing, drying, etc. Okay, it must be in English language, and it must be a permanent label, meaning that a sticker is not enough. It has to be a, well, you see this thing on the left, a nylon patch, for example, a folded nylon patch. That's still the most common one. But we see more and more printed labels, like a print directly on the inside of the T-shirt, for example. But it has to be permanent. Now, fiber composition, this refers to, well, 100% cotton, 98% polyester, 2% spandex, or whatever. That's actually not mandatory. It's up to you. But of course, I recommend that because you're going to have a hard time selling that to retailers or end consumers if you don't have the fiber composition. Same thing goes for size. Country of origin, such as made in China, made in Vietnam, is actually optional. But at least when it comes to fiber composition and size, I would definitely add that. Okay? And as said, you Australians have a fantastic website, productsafety.gov.au. This is just a very brief introduction. Okay, last but not least, we have textiles lab testing. And the purpose of lab testing for textiles is to verify if the material contains excessive amounts of certain chemicals or heavy metals, or if it conforms to children's clothing standards, which are broader in scope than just checking certain substances. Now, I'm going to focus on the chemical testing in this video. So, as I mentioned, it can be tricky to find compliance testing companies or labs that actually cover Australian and New Zealand standards outside of Australia and New Zealand. I would say that majority of people on our website and also YouTube channel are importers, especially in Australia, especially in the region. So this means that most of you are likely looking for a testing company based close to the manufacturing base. So that could be in Hong Kong, could be in Singapore or something like that, or maybe even in mainland China. What I recommend that you do in that case is that don't ask for, hey, can you test our product according to Australian textiles chemicals regulations, because as I demonstrated, it's not that clear cut, but it's not clear cut at all actually. So what you do is that you can book testing according to, say, the EU REACH regulation, and that's sort of a catch-all because that way you can also sell in the EU, or you can list a specific set of, hey, I want you to check for AZO, formaldehyde, and PCBs, okay? That way you get a test report for three specific standards. I also suggest that you check out the article we have about EU and US textiles regulations, because many of you Australians and also New Zealand-based companies are not just looking to sell domestically but also overseas. But even if you just intend to sell within Australia or New Zealand for that matter, you could actually get it lab tested according to EU or even US regulations or frameworks. And why that is of relevance is because it's far easier. I would say that most testing companies primarily cover European and US regulations. It can be quite tricky to find Australian labs, at least outside of Australia, that covers Australian regulations. Okay. That said, it's not mandatory as long as we're not talking children's clothing. Then it's a different story. Then you should definitely work with an Australia-based testing company. Okay, let's summarize this. So the first thing you need to do is to assess which substance regulations apply to your product. And if it's just Australia, it's pretty clear cut. I just explained how that works. But if you do intend to, as an Australian company, also sell overseas, either directly through, say, a fulfillment center, or first by importing into Australia and then shipping B2C from Australia, then you need to comply with the regulations in your target market. So if you're an Australian company intending to sell on, say, Amazon in the States or Amazon in the EU, then you also need to comply with regulations in the target market. So it's not decided by, well, your residency or your corporate residency. Step 2, you have to create the label files. You can do that in Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, but keep in mind you can't ask your factory in Ho Chi Minh City or Dongguan or Hangzhou and say, hey, I want you to create a label that complies with Australian regulations, because they don't know, they have no clue how to design a label file that complies with Australian labeling requirements, not just Australian, but any label for any overseas market for that matter. Okay, in step 3, order product samples and book third-party lab testing. Okay, so it's a pretty basic strategy when it comes to, well, when it comes to textiles, at least in Australia. So, a couple of questions in the FAQ. I'm importing products from overseas. Am I responsible for ensuring compliance? Yes. A common misunderstanding is that, oh, it's a supplier, they should know. But it's not really like that. As they can confirm that, okay, we can comply with, say, REACH, or we could comply with, well, we can ensure that the product doesn't contain excessive amounts of acet or formaldehyde or something like that. But that's about as far as, you know, the suppliers' expertise goes. They will not help you with, you know, booking lab testing. They will not assist with creating the label files. And end of the day is your responsibility. Should something happen, meaning that the goods should be subject to a recall, then it's your loss, not their loss. Okay. So who covers the lab testing cost? Well, unfortunately, that's you. You know, manufacturing, you know, contract manufacturing, doesn't matter where it is really. It's like, you know, low-cost airlines. You don't get, like, no extras included, okay? So if you need to get your product lab tested, then you have to pay the bill. It's just the way it works. You can't ask or expect your supplier to cover the cost in full or in part. Okay, how can I reduce the lab testing cost? Because the thing is that lab testing can be quite costly. The reason is that the testing costs are actually multiplied based on the number of fabrics and also colors. So if you have one fabric, you're looking at maybe 100 USD or something like that. But what if you have 5 different colors on 2 different, you know, different fabrics? One is a cotton fabric, one is a polyester fabric. All of a sudden you have 10 different fabrics and colors. That's $1,000, maybe even more. So while this may stifle a creative process, I understand that. The best way to reduce the testing cost, other than just skipping out on testing, is to reduce the number of fabrics and colors. Okay, and I understand that may not always be an option, but that's really the only way, at least when it comes to textiles. So how do you create the label file? Now, you know, you can actually just write something down on a napkin. It doesn't really matter. Well, then it will actually look like handwriting, so you may not actually want that. But what matters is that you
get everything down on paper or well specifically in a file, as long as you show exactly what the supplier should print on the label or directly on the fabric, then that's okay. That's mission accomplished. Okay. I recommend that you use something like, well, Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, but you could use Paint. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to look that good, but it's a lot better than nothing, because labeling is that mandatory. It's not voluntary. If you don't know how to use software like Illustrator or Photoshop, just go on Fiverr, okay? But even then, you have to confirm the specific information that the freelancer has to put into the label. Because at the end of the day, the supplier, they will just take the file, they will print whatever's in the file. It doesn't matter. They are not going to verify that. They will not go on product safety Australia and make sure that you got everything right. They take whatever and they just print it, and that's it, and you get whatever you specify. Right, so what can happen if you import non-compliant products when it comes to chemicals and heavy metals? It's still quite relaxed in Australia. I believe that's going to change in the future. I said I hope so. But right now it's pretty laid back. At least in that aspect. But what if you import a product that's incorrectly labeled? Now the customs authorities will they don't have time to check every single label of every single shipment coming in. But if you are reported by, say, a consumer or something like that, then what could possibly happen is that you're subject to a recall, meaning that you have to buy back the product pretty much. Retailers will just ship it back to you. Or if in a scenario when the ACC has a reasonable reason to believe that your product does contain excessive amounts of certain chemicals, especially PCBs, then they can actually issue a recall, which is financial ruin if you're a small business. I believe that the risk of that happening for most fabrics is extremely low. So this is not like an everyday issue. It's not something that happens all the time. Enforcement when it comes to children's clothing is of course a lot more strict. So lab testing is absolutely it's not necessary. It's a legal requirement, okay? Because should something happen, God forbid, then you're not just looking at a recall. You're looking at fines starting from about $500,000 Australian dollars and up. So that means when it comes to anything used by kids, for obvious reasons, the stakes are much higher. But yeah, you have a clear incentive to ensure that the imported products are fully compliant. Now, if you need help, because I understand it can be confusing, you can use our free service on compliancegate.com/help and just fill in information about the product name, what you want us to do for you, the target market, that's where you plan to sell the product, and your details. And we will get back to you with a free quotation detailing how we can assist you through the compliance process. It's completely free. It's up to you if you want to work with us or not, but you can go on compliancegate.com/help and get a free quotation today.